I spoke to a gentleman in that business and I asked him about his typical day. And he said, well, I come to work, I log on to 6 different systems with 6 different 10-digit passwords, except then is I run a half or 1 day workshop in person. The advantage of that is it's done, as you said, at the operational level. So there's operations managers, production managers, engineering managers. The moment we got power on the building, the next day we ran up the IT systems, and under 2 weeks later we were in full production.
Welcome back to ByteSized. Thank you so much for joining us again today. I'm Kyler Cheatham, your host, and on ByteSized, we dissect topics in digital transformation and enterprise tech at a very high level so that we're able to diversify our audience and really help people understand concepts that can be very, very technical. And today, we're going to talk about a very trending topic here with my friend and colleague, John. So John, welcome to the show. Can you give us just a quick intro and your background?
Good morning or good afternoon for you, Kyla. My background is in manufacturing. This is my 49th year, so a few grey hairs earned along the way. Started life as a mechanical engineer, got into automation very early in my career and built an automation company in the mid-90s, and then spent probably the next 19, 20 years integrating SAP with factory floor as a solution architect. So I have a very good understanding of the type of data that manufacturers produce at the plant floor level, what to do with it and how to deliver it to people at the right time in the right way, in the way that they can consume it.
Well, definitely a very important skill set, especially for our conversation today. So today we're talking about Industry 4.0 and digital transformation, and that's what a lot of your thought leadership is around. So
Yes.
Industry 4.0 is a lot like AI. We kind of understand it to an extent, but still don't really know what it is. So in your definition, what is Industry 4.0?
Nothing more than the convergence of 3 technology sets. So effectively, Industry 4.0 was inevitable. If we look at the first industrial revolution in 1784, it was about mechanization. If we look at the second industrial revolution in 1870, it was about electrification. The third industrial revolution is, named to have started in 1969 when Neil Armstrong was walking on the moon, and that was about computerization. And now we're at the point where with Industry 4.0, it's really the convergence of what is known as cyber physical systems. So your dashboard in a car is a cyber physical system that shows you what's going on under the bonnet. Cloud computing, which has become quite ubiquitous. And the industrial Internet of Things, which is the extracting information from the types of equipment and sensors that we'd find in a typical factory, whether it's controllers, what they call SCADA systems, HMIs, robots, whatever you'd typically find and pieces of machinery that you typically find in a manufacturing environment. Industry 3.0 was about getting that equipment computerized and connected to a network. Industry 4.0 is about taking that information and doing something with it. And Industry 4 itself has 4 stages of maturity. The first stage is being able to see what you're doing remotely. The second stage is then understanding what you're seeing in terms of context. The third stage is then knowing that the data you're collecting is trustworthy, therefore I can predict what's going to happen. And then the fourth stage of maturity is closing the loop. It's, well, based on what I'm seeing, I'm going to make an automatic adjustment to my process, which is effectively closing the loop, to optimize and adapt before the issue arises within the process.
Very cool. Well, that is definitely a very digestible definition. So thank you for that. So when we talk about Industry 4.0, what are some practical applications? Can you give us an example of something that we might see every day or that we might utilize as consumers that use Industry 4.0 technologies and connectivity?
So probably the simplest example I use is one of what's known as a piece of equipment known as a check weigher. Anybody who buys anything from a supermarket that's a fast-moving consumer good, a jar of coffee or a packet of chips, will understand that those packs are weighed individually as they come towards the end of the packing line to make sure that each pack is filled or each jar is filled with the correct amount. So you can imagine that the weights of those items varies just by virtue of the way that they're made. So I can go down to a check weigher in a factory and I can stand there and I can look at the screen on the check weigher and I can monitor and watch those weights as a human. But the Industry 4.0 Industry 3.0 is closing out that part of the evolution of the machine by having it connected and computerized and then connecting it to a network. So Industry 4.0 step one that I mentioned, the seeing piece, the visibility piece, is saying, well, I want to sit at my desk or remotely and I want to view those weights in real time. So I can now see that taken from the machine and put on a dashboard or my desktop computer or whatever. Step two then says, well, I'm making jars of coffee that are supposed to be 500 grams, but where do I get the standard from to compare it to? And that typically will come from another system, like an ERP system, SAP, for example. And from that, I can get the standard that I should be making 500 gram jars of coffee. And I can see a 480 gram jar and a 505 gram jar. So I now start to plot the collection of that information against my standards. So I now get context as to what my process is doing. If I want to get really clever, I can then put that information onto a statistical process control chart, which will show me the natural variation in the filling process. And I can then monitor that to make sure that even though there's variance in weights, am I sitting within my what are called upper and lower control limits to make sure I'm making the specification. And based on that, I can then see that, oh, look at that. I can now see I've got some weights that are getting heavy. And I'm overfilling my jars and moving to a upper control limit and then eventually an upper specification limit, which means I'm going to be making reject products. So I will make an adjustment to the process by talking to the filler operator, for example, and saying, hey, turn it down a bit to make slightly lighter jars, and then I'll monitor that and see how that goes. That's the third level, which is the predicting piece, knowing I'm going to make out a specification product. The holy grail is really the fourth step, where a control system monitors those weights, sees that we're about to make out a specification product, and automatically tells the filling system, turn it down a bit, using some control logic, so that we don't make out a specification product. And it's then mining that level 4, the optimize and adapt piece, where the machine learning and artificial intelligence can then come in, because it can start analysing that data, know what we've done before, and then make an informed choice based on history.
Absolutely. That's a fascinating example. And, two of my favorite things, coffee and chips. So absolutely love that example. And so you mentioned a critical transition in that overall process. You mentioned when you go to more of an autonomous system where it's actually making strategic business decisions itself based on the data and obviously the programming that goes into that. You had said in the first example, when we were still kind of in that third phase of understanding that we needed to monitor those fill levels, that we said to, the fill level manager, which would be a human resource, I assume, that you need to lower the fill levels. And that's something that I want to ask you about, that is definitely involved in the narrative around Industry 4.0, is the human kind of erasing the human need in the workforce. Can you kind of speak to what that actually looks like in a practical application?
So in a process that I do called a readiness assessment for a manufacturing organisation, one I completed for an organisation last year, I spoke to a gentleman in that business and I asked him about his typical day. And he said, well, I come to work, I log on to 6 different systems with 6 different 10-digit passwords that the IT department says I'm not allowed to write down. If I get them wrong, I have to lodge a ticket to get my password reset. I go to 6 different systems and I extract flat files, CSV files, whatever I can out of those systems. I bring them into my master spreadsheet. I mash all that up, and by lunchtime, I might have a graph that shows me that I'm where I'm meant to be. For me, that's a complete waste of time for a human to have to do that every single day. He should be able to come. So he spends probably 24 to 30 hours a week just collecting and mashing up the information to give him a result. We have the capability these days, because of connectivity, because of computerization, because of the tools, IoT, IoT tools that we have to collect all that information and create a dashboard where he comes into work and he has 4 dials, 3 are green, 1 is red, and he goes, that's what I need to look at today. So rather than spending time being a data go-getter, he spends his time looking at the problems that are in the process and fixing them and doing the analysis for continuous improvement rather than just trying to work out what happened yesterday or last week. And I see particularly operational people. If you think about a stratification in an organisation, and then the top of the layer, I would call them the knowledge workers. They're the people that sit in the office and use all sorts of systems. They have laptops and 3 screens on their desk, and they're using a finance system, an ERP system, HR system, whatever it is. And those knowledge workers have been used to working in those realms for 20, 30 years. At the factory floor level, those knowledge workers are usually bereft of the real-time information they need in order to make good decisions. And that example I've just provided is one where that person isn't working on continually improving the process. He's working on collecting information that he should be able to get automatically, and even the analysis could be done automatically for him. So his time is then better spent on solving problems and continually improving the process rather than just being a data getter.
So it sounds like you're saying, John, that the misconception a lot of times that we have is Industry 4.0 will take human jobs. And you're saying it actually makes human jobs more efficient and strategic. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, ultimately, yes. And allows people to focus on the problems that should be focused on. I mean, if you know W. Edward Deming, who's the father of modern quality control, and he has the plan, do, check, act, the PDCA cycle, and the image he shows is the PDA as a wheel moving up the hill. So you plan, you do, you check, you act, and then based on that, you make a process improvement, and then you end up moving that PDCA cycle further up the hill, and that's the definition of continuous improvement.
I love that. I think that's important to have
There's
that
a really good
conversation.
there's a really good Lego meme, and it's 2 guys pushing a Lego cart with square wheels, and there's a guy standing behind them with a round wheel going, hey guys, I've got a great idea for you. And they're going, can't you see we're too busy?
Yeah. Absolutely. That's the personification of innovation, right? Is the ability to take those ideas and actually acclimate it. And my son absolutely loves Legos, and it's
Yeah.
something we spend a ton of time doing. But a lot of times, those process pieces can be so applicable to digital transformation. I even saw some of our colleagues and thought leaders actually building Legos, explaining the foundation of the house and how you can kind of redo different microservices. I think they're a great tool to kind of explain a lot of different things through that gamification of understanding. So I love that example.
And people, unfortunately, are a little bit afraid.
Hmm.
But it's
Exactly.
like being afraid of electricity in the 1870s or afraid of computerization in the 1960s. And that fear is, founded today in AI and ChatGPT and platforms that are out there
Hmm.
that are doing that as well. And I do believe there is, at some point, a risk to the types of work that we do. But
Hmm.
every evolution that we've seen through history has resulted in a shift in jobs, not necessarily a
Hmm.
loss.
Absolutely.
I read a quote from a guy a few years ago. I can't remember who wrote it, but he basically said the illiterate of the 21st century are not the ones who cannot read and write. They're the ones who can't learn, unlearn, and relearn.
That is fascinating. That's a really, really powerful quote right there, because that absolutely is so true. More of, like you said, the movement, the mobility of the workforce, and the ability to do things like upskill, which we talk about a lot, specifically kind of in the digital transformation world. I want to ask you one more question, kind of about your process that is a little unique, and then we can kind of move on to talking about Industry 4.0 and digital transformation specifically.
Mm-hmm.
But I know part of your work is you actually start with workshops with the operational team before
Yes.
you ever get to executive workshops. And I want to touch on that for our audience so that they can really understand the importance of actually talking to the operational team that will execute the technology as opposed to the executive team first. So, can you kind of take us through your thought process there?
So I had an engagement, a global medical devices company that was absolutely seamless and very successful for both them and me in terms of the engagement. And it was like, well, what was it about that went so well? So I threw some support and training for a guy that I know who's promotes a thing called the Genius Model Method. I decided to look at what was my model, and I came up with what I call the 4-tiered engagement model. The first entry level, if you like, for them is simply a 40-minute keynote that can be delivered over Zoom or other Teams or Google Meets, other streaming platforms. And the idea is for them to get to meet me, for me to get to meet them, and to try and get the organisation, a vertical slice of the organisation for people that are interested in this topic, to get them to understand what Industry 4 is and isn't, to simplify it, dumb it down, and take away the mystique and the myths that are circulating out there in society. The next step then is I run a half or 1 day workshop in person. The advantage of that is it's done, as you said, at the operational level. So there's operations managers, production managers, engineering managers. And I found in running those that the buzz that's created in the room as these people start to share their pain points and what keeps them up at night, it's real stuff. And yet the issues that they're facing are the same issues that almost every organisation is facing. Lack of visibility, lack of real-time information, lack of systems as knowledge workers that can help them make better decisions, lack of timely information coming to them, getting rid of paperwork because there's so much paperwork, the hundreds of spreadsheets that organisations have that have been built simply because needs must, because they don't have the tools and systems they need in order to give them the information they need in the way they need to use it. And that gives me then an understanding of what they perceive to be the real issues at the coalface of the factory floor. The next step then is a readiness assessment where I interview the senior execs, C-suite, senior leadership team, and their private 1 hour recorded confidential interviews. And it's an opportunity for me to tease out of them, where do you see the business in 3 to 5 years? What is your vision and strategy? And a lot of organisations that I've done this for actually don't have one. So some wag once said, when you don't know where you're going, any road will do. And so without an understanding of what the summit might look like for them, they really don't have a direction to follow. So that allows me to get an understanding from them where they are, where they want to go, what they perceive to be the issues of the business, and a bigger picture. But what it also does, it gives me insight into the alignment or misalignment between what the factory floor people are telling me and the senior leadership team are telling me. And I can look for areas of alignment, I can look for areas of misalignment, and I present that back to the business in a 25 to 30 page properly published strategic document. And then I present that back to them in a lunch and learn format again. These were the salient points that came out of it. And if they then want some help, my next step is to go into a part-time advisory role for 2 to 4 hours a week to hold their hand, create a team internally, cross-functional, cross-departmental representation, hold their hand while we then look at the strategy and work out where should we start with the low-hanging fruit, get some budget, and then start doing the small things. And I'm very cautious of doing what are called proof of concept pilots, because we've been taking data from the edge for 30 years and doing stuff with it. We don't need to do that anymore. What we do need to do is start doing proof of value pilots, that if we do this work, what is the contribution to the profitability or the triple bottom line, the people, profit, and the planet of the business? Because ultimately it's the CFO who's going to sign off on whether the projects will get funding into the future, and he or she needs to see that there's a return on investment, and it's a good return on investment.
My goodness, I'm going to have to stop myself from asking all of the questions in that amazing information, because that was such good. And I promise to the audience, we'll have John back if he's willing, and we'll unpack that, because that value-driven proof of concept is so important, as well as the CIO, CTO, CFO dynamic within those projects. So we'll put a pin on that. We'll beg John to join us again and kind of talk through that. But the reason I wanted to bring that up for our audience today is that methodology of really listening to each level of the organization and then diagnosing, I think, is so healthy. And a lot of times that's what's missing in our industry, is that important level of seeing what is the operational piece of that before we go to the executive team. So we kind of have those levels of what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and do we actually know where we're going as far as alignment, especially with emerging technologies like AI, like Industry 4.0, like all of these different machine learning, predictive analytics. Those types of systems are absolutely critical to understand in that level. So I think that's absolutely genius. And I want to kind of flip that into talking about Industry 4.0 and digital transformation, because a lot of times that's a similar methodology, except we have kind of vendors and SIs in the mix, and we have to do some management on that side. So can you at a top level explain to us why a lot of times they're in the same conversation, digital transformation and Industry 4.0?
Digital transformation is, in my view, if you're looking at a manufacturing environment, it is the ability where we would have a tiered pyramid. And at the top,
Mm-hmm,
we'd have the system of record, the ERP system. Orders would then be pushed down into a manufacturing execution layer. In the old days, it was a piece of paper, it was a production order or a work
mm-hmm,
order. It would be given to the factory floor. They would work out what they were going to make and when they were going to make it based on factors, labour, raw materials.
mm-hmm,
That would then be executed on the factory floor through SCADA systems,
mm-hmm,
system control and data requisition systems, and eventually through the automation layer. And the transfer of information was always from layer to layer to layer. The whole idea of digital transformation is to turn that pyramid around, in the sense that you have a manufacturing integration hub that sits in the middle, and the orders can come down from the ERP system into the hub, and the hub can then distribute that information to the systems in the factory floor that need it. We call it the hub and spoke arrangement, where one spoke is the ERP, the
mm-hmm,
hub is the manufacturing intelligence hub that sits in the middle of all that, and then it can communicate backwards and forwards with each individual piece of equipment. And we practiced this. Probably the best job I ever did was 2011 with Coca-Cola here in
mm-hmm.
Australia, when they built a very special injection molding facility to make what they call the preforms that then become the bottles.
Wow.
And that system from go to woe was built within 6 months. There was a manufacturing integration hub in the middle that took all the orders from SAP in real time and then distributed that information out onto the factory floor. So all the data in that business 13 years later is still flowing in real time between all those systems. And it got over the fact that we had an international vendor cast. We had injection molding machines from Canada. We had automated guided vehicles from the States. We had resident management from Italy. We had machines
Wow.
from Germany doing vision inspection. And trying to get them to talk to each other was going to be impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So we developed a hub where the hub spoke to them, and all we needed was one connection to their control system. And we told them before they even came into Australia what we needed from their system. And literally, from the moment we got power on the building, the next day we ran up the IT systems, and under 2 weeks later we were in full production.
Wow, that is
Um,
incredible.
yeah, it was. It was an amazing project to be involved with, because we thought about what does the data model look like in terms of the information we need to feed onto large format televisions and operators' dashboards, so they can see what's going on in the process. And to this day, it's almost a lights out factory. I think there are 5 people, run the entire factory floor, and it
Wow.
produces preforms for the whole of Australia, New Zealand, and some export markets as well.
Wow, that is absolutely an incredible story. And it sounds like a lot of that is because you started with the data model. You started
Yeah.
with the ability to make sure that that quality, that governance, that hygiene was all there, so that you're able to give a system clean data, that it can actually give outputs that are of benefit to the business, that we can help us make strategic decisions and be efficient. And I think that's the biggest piece of industry 4.0, is the
Mm.
ability to utilize data. But before we do that, we see so many legacy systems. This is a huge issue with the SAP S4 HANA migration, kind of, that's going on now, in that 2027 deadline that's
Yes.
looming, is the data is not there. And that's a huge problem. I know you know that better than I do on that level. And to be able to activate any of these technologies in your organization, that is a critical step to making sure that's done before there's any sort of talk of a migration or a new implementation.
Yes. And I liken the digital transformation journey. I had a conversation recently with the business. The executive general manager for operational excellence said partway through the conversation to me, "You're not convincing me this is a journey we need to undertake." And I was like, whoa, backpedal here.
Yeah.
I'm not here to convince you of anything. That's the job of your
Exactly.
leadership. And if they're not committed to the journey, it is of no consequence to me. And anyway, he got off the call, and I spoke to the guy who was trying to surreptitiously do these little proof of concept pilots to try and show there was value. And I said to him, "I have a question for you. In your lifetime, do you want to climb Mount Kilimanjaro?" And he said, "Well, why are you asking me that?" I said, "Well, it's a fair question. Is it on your bucket list?" He goes, "I haven't thought about it." I said, "Well, I do." And I said, "For me, it's a yes or no answer."
Yeah.
And if it's yes, well, then we work out, how do I get there? What do I need? Training, equipment, flights, porters, in order to do that journey. But the initial decision is, yes, I do. So the organisation at the leadership level needs to decide yes or no. You either want to go on the journey, and then you work out how, or you don't, and you stay where you are, was back in steam in 1870, or not computerising in the 1960s, 1970s. And that's really what it boils down to. It's not that hard a decision to make. And it doesn't mean you do it all at once. It means you do it in a strategic, practical, and effective way.
Absolutely. That is so well said. And I think that simplification a lot of times is what we're missing as business leaders, is that ability to be a leader and make that decision, let it trickle down to the rest of the organization and support, as opposed to not support on that level. So I think that that's perfectly said, and a great way to kind of wrap up our conversation. And just so you know, Mount Kilimanjaro is a yes from me too. So maybe we can do our next conversation at the top. Might be a bit windy, but I don't know. But this has been so incredibly insightful on both, the Industry 4.0 side, on the digital transformation side, on the methodology side. So thank you so much, John. How can our audience get in touch with you if they want to talk to you about potentially using your methodology or reaching out to you to ask questions, anything like that?
I'm very active on LinkedIn. They can just search for me as John Broadbent on LinkedIn, and they'll see Industry 4 come up. There aren't that many of us with that name doing that work on the world stage. And they can just reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'm more than happy then to share with them a white paper that I produced last year, which is how to use Industry 4 to improve manufacturing performance. And it's been critically reviewed. I've had great feedback. I'm more than happy to share that to help manufacturers do more with less.
Absolutely. It is a wonderful piece, highly recommend. And as always, I will link our guest information below in the show notes. And also, I encourage the audience, if you do have questions for John and you want me to tag him in them, just go ahead and pop them in the comments wherever you're viewing today, and we can garner those up and revisit those with John on LinkedIn. So thank you so much again, John, for joining us today. And thank you to the audience. I am Kyler Cheatham. This is ByteSized, and we will see you next time.